निबिडनवजपारागसन्तानहासि ज्योत्स्नाजालैर्नखानां कुलकमलवनीकान्तकान्तिप्रकाशं गङ्गाकाश्यादि तीर्थोल्लसदमल महापुण्यपुञ्जप्रवाहं वन्दे दीक्षा गुरूणां चरणसरसिजद्वन्द्वम् आनन्दकन्दम्. Namaste. The topic that I have chosen is Veda and art. As is with the case of so many other things that are linked with our life, such as various branches of science, various kinds of traditional arts also find their roots in the Vedic lore. Alankara Shastra talks of poetry, and the utterances of Kavi Rishis are no less kavya just because they are accorded the status of Prabhu Samhita. It is well said by Ananda Kumaraswamy that we must accordingly regard the Vedic Kavi as the archetype of every poet, and with the Vedic mantra as the exemplum of all art. In this paper, I am concentrating only on two of the visual arts, namely drawing and painting and sculpture, and that too very specifically from the perspective of how they have developed from the Vedic roots. The next slide. Why is art so predominantly visual? Now, kale andid takshana kannu munde barodanna matra imagine ಮಾಡ್ಕೋತೀವಿ. Man is essentially a visual creature. It is said, sarvendriyanam nayanam pradhanam. Ella indriyagallalli nayanave mukhyavadaddu. Even neurologically speaking, the area of visual cortex in the occipital lobe, which is at the back of the brain, it is responsible for processing vision, and it has the biggest share amongst the neurons of the brain. And perhaps for this reason, we link vision with all other senses, and finally with perception and understanding itself. For instance, we say, muttu nodu, tindu nodu, chakhe dekho. Do you see the point? We may add that our rishis associated with the various mantras in the Vedas are also called drashtaraha, or the seers. So I am considering here what is essentially static visual arts. What holds for one kind of art holds for others by Sthali Pulaka Nyaya, particularly when we are talking of the philosophical elements that are independent of the medium and their representation. This said, I also wish to bring to your attention that traditional Indian art has been primarily symbolic, and the farther we look into the history, the greater is the abstraction. Kumaraswamy establishes in one of his papers that there is an anthropomorphic representation, that is, superimposing the human form to abstract concepts or any non-human elements, that abounds in the later art, while the earlier art is much more uniconic. That means that when the Supreme Being is being represented either as an image or as a living tree or a sound or a geometric form, it is but a symbol. Actually, when it is represented as a human form also, it has to be treated as a symbol. It is not the likeness of anything presented to the eye's intrinsic faculty, says Kumaraswamy. Indeed, what is fodder for only the senses does not involve the exercise of the intellect, however skillfully represented, is merely an occasion to the sensation. It can be called at most a skill, but not an art. I'd like to draw your attention to the realistic, lifelike Greek sculptures and the symbolic sculptures of the Indic traditions. The next slide, please. When we consider the earliest samples of art, some Buddhist sculptures belonging to the 1st century BC and the earliest available Hindu sculptures are from the Gupta period, which is around the 6th century of the Common Era. Samples have not been available prior to that does not mean that there never was art. Absence of evidence does not imply evidence of absence. It merely means that the media that was used has not really survived. We have to consider the construction of the various types of yajna vedis for the different yajnas. That can also show a lot of artistic element in it. The next slide, please. This is the symbol of my institution, NIAS, which shows the Shena, which incidentally represents the yajna vedi constructed for the Shena yajna. The next slide. The Rangavalli, which is drawn in front of the house, or the Rangavalli that is drawn on the Havanakunda, also is a form of art. By its very nature, the medium is but transient. David Shulman has analyzed this intended transience of Rangavalli or Kolam. This art has been kept alive not because the medium in which it is shown is enduring, but the tradition itself has endured. The next slide. In all our texts, right from the Vedas, one comes across a whole host of metaphors which vividly portray what is very difficult to imagine. For instance, in the Kathopanishad, we have the Ratha metaphor, which is the linked metaphor, Atmanam Rathinam Vidhi, etc. In the Purusha Sukta, we come across the animated metaphor, Brahmano asya mukhamasit, bahura janyah kritah, uru tadasya yadvaishyah, padhyam shudro ajayata. Then there is the beautiful temporal metaphor, Vasanto asya sidajyam grishma idma sharad dhavihi. Vasanta Ritu is the very celebration of life. Vasanta bringing out the sneha is likened to the ajya. Sharat Ritu brings out the bounty of nature and also the pleasantness and purity, so it is likened to the havis. And in between them is Grishma with its scorching heat, very aptly likened to Idma or the fire sticks. All this was linguistic representation. When we come to the Chitra or Shilpa representation, they apparently move chronologically from the uniconic to the iconic, as shown clearly by Kumaraswamy. Contrary to what historians claim, he says that Buddha was not divinized later but actually humanized. To see a few examples, the earliest Buddha art shows only the pada, which is shown on the leftmost picture, or as the chakra or the Agni. The later Buddha takes human forms in the sculptures that appear in the following centuries. The significant point here is that certain symbol persists through the later age also, when anthropomorphism has become more common. Here we see an apparent contradiction. When we have looked at the metaphors, the linguistic expression actually tries to make vivid what are very abstract concepts. But in contradiction, the sculptures that we see, sculptures or the representation in Chitra, actually shows a very abstract form. But this is only an apparent contradiction, not a real one. Meaning to say there is no actual virodha, but it's a virodhavasa. Because both metaphorical language as well as symbolic representation, they attempt to bring a certain level of graspability to the abstract concept, and so they bring the indescribable within the grasp of the senses. Also, in my opinion, another element of using either of these expressions. In Kavya, we know that the meaning that is suggested, not what is literally said, is more powerful and effective. Similarly, so is the case in these arts. This is because even with the infinite possibilities of linking of ideas opening up to the mind with a given symbol or a metaphor, it automatically confines itself with a certain circumference of likely and plausible possibilities. Even in the most apparently illogical set of ideas linked together, the mind has an amazing rationality in culling out only the most relevant ones. So is also the way this operates, and this symbolism is employed. It is a contradictory piece of work, since a symbol such as a lotus or a swastika or a pranava are concrete enough representations to be beheld by the senses, but they are abstract enough to let our intellect function. In the context of traditional arts, the artist possesses in his vision an ideal which is complete with beauty and perfection in form. And his task is then to give expression through the various media such as stone or paint, be it dance or music or sculpture. The reality as he sees it would have assumed a different meaning because he has internalized that vision of perfection. This concern in form is predominant in the traditional Indian artist. Though he gives this form many forms, he has in mind that one perfect form to copy from. This is truly the idea of the archetype. To achieve a representation of this in actuality, the artist resorts to what Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan has called the impersonalization of the subjective, and this leads to an abstract design. And what else than the abounding images from our oldest texts to provide grace to this artist's mill. The next slide, please. Coming to one concrete example of an idea, take for instance the representation of a lotus in the traditional art. We have come across lotuses in metaphors such as the hand being the lotus, the face being the lotus, etc. The lotus mudra in dance, lotuses in sculptures and paintings, serving as seats, being held in the deity's hand, lotus in yoga and tantra where references to Hrit Kamala and Shat Kamala, talking of lotuses in the Shat chakras, etc. Let us look at all the metaphors on common parlance that connect to the lotus from a usage point of view. It's very common to hear, even in the vernaculars, Adidavare of one's guru, Mukha Kamala, Kara Kamala, etc. When we look at the lines from Shri Sukta, Padma Priya, Padmini, Padma Haste, etc., there is reference to Shri being fond of lotus. She herself is Padmini. She holds a Padma in her hand, signifying a Leela Kamala, etc. This goes back to the Khila Bhaga of the Rig Veda. We find abounding metaphors regarding lotuses in Dasa Sahitya and Vachana Sahitya as well. If we consider Sahitya of Annamacharya of 15th century, he praises Sriman Narayana as Kamala Sati Mukha Kamala Kamala Hita Kamala Priya Kamalekshana Kamala Sanahita Garuda Gamana Shri Kamalabhani Padakavalame Sharanu. So there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 references to lotus in the very form of Sriman Narayana himself. The next slide. Seeking parallels of these metaphors in Chitra and Shilpa, because the artist draws his inspiration from these symbolisms themselves. We see Hindu deities such as Lakshmi, Hayagriva, Saraswati and Brahma principally depicted as being seated on a lotus. Vishnu has a lotus growing from his navel. Often deities are portrayed as sporting a lotus in their lotus bud in their hand. The next slide. It's not just Hindu art, but in Buddhist art as well we see this. Buddha is often placed on a lotus seat. Even other bodhisattvas are placed on lotuses, although they might be smaller lotuses. It's not as though it's a random idea which took someone's fancy and found its way into the Sahitya or into the sculptures of paintings, be it the earliest of artists or the much later ones. It all has a strong, sound metaphysical meaning and philosophical basis. So what does a Kamala represent? Brahma portrayed as Kamalasana and many a time seated on a lotus which emerges from Vishnu's navel. The primary ontological significance is the one regard to Astitva itself or the very existence. Lotus is seen as the firm ground. Here again there is an apparent contradiction because a delicate flower such as lotus to be perceived as a firm ground. The waters or the apaha represent the infinitely vast possibilities of existences in which the lotus grows. Seeing it in another way, the whole symbolism is about the creation, where one particular way of being is upheld. Since creation is about creating order from chaos, we can perhaps interpret the lotus with its arranged petals, etc., as representing order which has drawn from chaos, which is amorphous, unbounded waters. When we are considering samples of art, particularly the traditional Indian art, which is so closely tied up with the Vyashti of Indian philosophical thought, a knowledge of ontology is of very great importance. It's no use analyzing just the medium of art or the technique, particularly here, if the form which is so deeply rooted in ontology is not understood properly. So we have seen some of the samples of art. We have to go back to the Vedic literature, which gives the metaphors as the sources for these forms of art. The next slide. I'll just very quickly go through some of the sources. We find in Chandogya Upanishad referring to the Pundarika within. This is probably one of the earliest representations of metaphors on lotus with regard to existence. Then the next one, this quotation from Maitri Upanishad talks of the Hrit Pushkara, Pushkara meaning a lotus, posing the question of what is the lotus and what does it mean. With regard to lotus birth, lotus as the birth or seat or support, earliest mention is in Rig Veda 7:33:11, where Vasishtha who has been mentioned. The next one. Then, since lotus, the next slide. No, yeah, that one. Since lotus blooms with the sunrise, the sense of in the beginning is also depicted by the lotus. The symbolic lotus thus is the light of the heavens, both because of them as well as reflecting those heavenly lights. So, Maitrayani Samhita Maitrayani Samhita says this. Then the next one, stating, talking of transience, the famous Bhaja Govinda Stotra talks of Nalini Dalagata Jalamati Taralam. Another metaphor we come across is of purity. In the Bhagavad Gita, we get the expression Padma Patram Ivambhasa. Padma is the noble here, although it is living in the mire, it draws its sustenance from it, it is still pure. Then, to turn the metaphor upside down, there is the quotation from the Chandogya which says, since do not attach to the comprehensor, just as lotus water does not stick to the lotus. Further, we find Kamala as the Leela Kamala in the hand of the deity. There it is but a toy, just as the universe, that is the Kamala, is a toy in the hands of the Supreme Being. All the references mentioned thus far have been from Vedic and Vedantic sources. Traversing a long temporal distance, even the Sahitya of the recent times, such as the Prarthana Shloka that I sang, it is actually a 17th century verse, and that also talks of Charana Sarasija of the Guru. It's not just lotus that is the significant symbol that comes out of the Indian traditional art. We find several others such as swastika, wheel, Shri Chakra, Meru Shri Chakra, etc. The symbol does not have to be visual either. So I have made a case study of just one of the symbols, which is the lotus, and its various manifestations in the visual art and its varied significance. An exhaustive study of the symbols is an interesting task in itself. We have thus looked into the Vedic foundations of art right from the available early ages through the various stages of art by exploring the metaphors that have been used.